Hello, everyone. This is Nick Cavalanti. I'm a contributing editor for the technology and channel brands of Penton. I'm coming to you live today from the Microsoft Ignite show floor, where topics like today's are of great interest. And I'm especially excited about today's session, Stopping Malware Before It Starts. Now, before we get started, what I'd like to do is I'd like to go through a couple of housekeeping items before we hear from our guest speaker. If you take a look at the widget bar, you'll notice a couple of options for you to take advantage of during today's session. The media player button is where you can control your volume. The Q&A button is where you're going to interact with the speaker. You can ask questions, make comments, whatever kind of strikes you during today's webcast. We make every effort to include you in on the conversation and answer every question posted, so be sure to populate something in there if a question kind of pops up in your mind while we're talking today. There's an online help connect there that connects you with the folks helping us run today's webinar should you need any assistance there. And we always encourage you to join in on the conversation on social media by tweeting throughout the webinar. So we want to get your thoughts, your views, your perspectives. And so use that Twitter button there to give your feedback and input on today's topic. Now, if you need some help with regard to how the sizing of the screen looks, you can go ahead and resize the slides as necessary using the slide area button. So that's always kind of helpful for most people, I think, as well. And with that kind of stuff kind of out of the way, let's talk a little bit about today's topic. And the topic of malware is something that every one of your customers is always worried about. And so I put a couple of slides together just to kind of introduce the topic. Then we'll hear from today's speaker, and I called this first slide "Why Malware Starts," and I really kind of thought I should actually name this "Why Malware is So Popular." And there's a couple of reasons why it starts, and therefore also why it's really popular today as an attack methodology. And the first one just kind of starts with the fact that it is so very intrusive. Malware utilizes a couple of mediums, that being email and utilizing websites. In this case, usually compromised websites or websites that are set up as part of malware, and I'll talk a little bit about that in one other slide. And these are some of the most interesting ways that anyone can gain entry directly into your organization, get past your firewalls, your application firewalls, any kind of security measures, your protocols, everything you have in place, because your users are allowing just about any piece of email in. Of course, you should have things like a email scanner, or maybe at a gateway and it's looking at attachments and things like that, sure. But putting those things aside for a moment, email becomes a vehicle that gets anybody on the planet able to talk to anyone directly within your organization. And then by the same token, kind of in the opposite direction, the web serves as a medium by which any one of your users can reach out well beyond that of your firewall and grab access to some of those delicious pieces of code and pull those in onto their endpoint. So it's one of those direct channels you really have to worry about. And one quick stat here from the Verizon Data Breach Investigations report is there that 66% you can see of malware here, it actually gets installed via email. Now, if you're not reading the Verizon Data Breach Investigations report every year, they come out around March or April every year, you want to be reading that report. It usually has tens of thousands of data breach incidents, and so it becomes extremely statistically relevant and represents basically the entire industry. Great report. Make sure you read that every year. Another reason why malware is so popular these days is that it's evasive. It's becoming more and more evasive. Traditional models of, let's say, antivirus and that kind of thing are looking at historical data, looking at, let's say, signatures, even heuristics. Even if you're looking at machine learning and AI, there's still some kind of historical basis to it, and malware tends to try and be as evasive as it can be. And so what happens is things like there's a study that was done by BT and KPMG about a year or so ago, and they found that 99% of the malware that they were seeing coming into their customers was actually the code itself was only used in that exact sort of that set of digits, that set of ones and zeros in that pattern was only used for under a minute, and then it was changed. And it was a completely different signature after that. And so that's kind of scary a little bit. And evasive malware uses other techniques, things like checking to see what kind of environment it's in. If it's running inside of a sandbox, a virtual environment, maybe the presence of analysis tools, things like that, it just doesn't even run. And that way it evades detection in an effort to maybe later on get run again by, let's say, a user on an endpoint where none of that exists, and then it can infect the machine. So it's becoming evasive in order to avoid detection and hopefully be more successful. And it is successful. It's a great means of gaining access to your organization. It becomes part of the intrusion kill chain. Once malware can be put on a machine, attackers tend to try and get stealth, persistence and so on a machine and get a foothold in your organization, and then begin to move laterally within the organization, trying to infect as many other machines as possible, all in an effort to then gain credentials and eventually gain access to your data. So this is something where you're trying to figure out, how do I stop it where it starts? I don't want to be stopping it later on in the horizontal kill chain where they're starting to move around in all of your organization, and they've got, they're on 5, 10, 100, 1,000, whatever of your endpoints. You want to stop it as early as you possibly can. And the reality is that malware is working. It's working for these cyber organizations, these criminal organizations that are leveraging code. They're looking at the security holes that exist in your organization, and they're leveraging them. A good example of that is, this comes from KnowBe4 put out an endpoint antivirus effectiveness report to see how good antivirus alone was at stopping ransomware. And you can see up here, on the average, it was 33% of organizations. And for your customers, which are probably not the average organization, meaning you think of the size, they're probably maybe in the smaller numbers. Some of you have certainly big organizations that are your customers, but some of you have 50 seats, 25 seats, 10 seats, 5 seats, whatever it is. And what you find is, kind of as is expected, as the number of employees goes down and their security focus kind of goes down too, we all kind of know that, the percentage went up much, much higher, double or more in a lot of cases for those smaller orgs. So malware is effective. So the next point I just want to make here is, the fact that if I kind of slide this over to the next slide, I think I did something here with my animation. Sorry about that. Let me run through these real quick, and there we go. And what I want to talk about is why the web is something that really needs to be a focus here. And I put it that it's malware's accomplice. It really is. Malware itself isn't just an executable that gets run. It's built into a number of components. I've just got a couple of them listed here, and depending on the malware, not every single one, it runs exactly the same way, but a couple of components here. You've got things like a dropper. In some cases, it's an executable that gets downloaded. Maybe it's in an attachment. But it also could be something where the dropper is an attachment, an executable, but it came by way of, let's say, it gets as complex as, like, let's say, a PDF that is a link to a Microsoft Word doc that then gets downloaded from the web, and that Word doc has inside of it a macro, which then goes and actually downloads the dropper. I mean, it gets really complex, and they're doing this on purpose in a way to obfuscate the tactics that are being used, as well as to try to avoid detection. But in the end, there has to be a dropper. Something's got to be run on your machine. That may go back to a C2, a command and control server, try to figure out what commands need to be run, and that C2 server might say, go over on the web to this other server that exists. It could be a compromised website where maybe someone's doing a hack against a particular platform of websites that they run on, that kind of thing, and then they'll go and they'll grab another piece of code, which that would be probably the payload. Payload gets executed on a machine, and then that way now you're infected. And there's a number of pieces, but all along the way, the web is kind of a constant theme. And so I put 2 notes here. It is playing a critical role. For the most part, if you just had a piece of malware that was downloaded and tried to run, today's antivirus, today's anti-malware engines, they're going to find it. And so leveraging the web becomes not just critical, but you can see here, it simply cannot survive without leveraging the web to some degree. So there's an accomplice here, and there's a focus, and that becomes your focus. If you think about the 2 slides together, what I'm trying to do here is, you're thinking, I want to stop this early, and I want to kind of take a look in detail, what's it doing, and therefore where should I be placing my security focus for my customers. And so there's this opportunity that exists for you. And you think about a security offering, and I know that our speaker today is going to talk about that as well a little bit. And I look at always there's 3 parts to the security offering you can buy. There's sort of the protection part, there's a prevention part, and then there's a response part. The prevention actually probably should be listed first. In this case, it's what can I put in place to make sure that something never gets in the organization ever. If that fails, or that isn't successful, I guess would be the way to put it, because you're protecting as best you can. It's a best effort for sure, but there's no 100% guarantee. Then you want to have some things in place to protect the organization. Maybe it's putting least privilege in place in Active Directory, or leveraging some other kind of tool set that maybe like privileged account management or something like that, trying to lock things down in order to protect what is accessible within the organization. And if that fails, or that's not successful, then you have incident response as well as part of your offering. And you'll want to look at leveraging solutions in a layered approach. We're going to hear about some of those today that are going to help with this offering here. And then really when you think about this, like I said before, you want to look and see how your enemy is, the tactics they use, the methodologies, the strategies, how are they thinking? Get into their mind, because what they did was they got into your mind. They got into to figure out what it is that you're doing to secure and to not secure your environments, and they want to take advantage of it. You need to do the exact same thing. So with that kind of intro, let me go ahead and introduce our speaker today. Our speaker today is Shane Cooper, and Shane is a senior sales engineer with Webroot, and he's got over 20 years of experience. He specialized in security, virtualization, systems administration, server administration. He's worked with thousands of IT administrators, MSPs, solution providers, systems architects, and the list kind of goes on and on. And Shane really brings a depth of experience and industry knowledge to the security solutions industry. So with that, Shane, I'm going to go ahead and hand things over to you. Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nick, for that great introduction. And handing off to, how do I get this? Rick, would you just get the next slide going, please?
Yep. If you just click the right arrow button, the little yellow arrow, you'll be able to click and do yourself, but I'll be happy to help if you need it.
Thanks. New tools, fun to always have to learn something different. Anyway, thanks, Nick, again. Today I'm going to kind of discuss and talk about something that most of us really aren't that familiar with. It's something that is kind of ubiquitous. It's called the domain name system, commonly referred to as DNS. These are things that are so ubiquitous that most of us have even forgotten that it's a security concern. It's so familiar that we've overlooked it, and in some cases just forgotten that it's one of the areas that the bad guys attack. Nick touched on a bunch of different options that folks do with droppers and trying to get files down. And so the DNS is just another layer of that protection to ensure that the bad guys do not get into your network. So what are some of the things we're going to talk about today? We're going to talk about how the network threat challenges are affecting your business, how the DNS protection actually can help. What is DNS and how does that help? How to protect your DNS connections and avoid those risks. What about protecting using DNS, and how does that work, and what does it do for you? And what are some of the benefits of DNS protection? What does it mean to you, and how does it affect your business? And then I'll just touch on briefly towards the end why Webroot is such a well-placed solution to help with that endeavor. So let's talk about the threats. What are we seeing out there? Nick touched on some statistics around malware and what kind of malware is showing up. But what about your network? These stats are taken from Arbor Networks. It's an infrastructure security report, very helpful for understanding how companies get attacked and what kind of trends that they're seeing. And some of the trends that we see are many customers, 67%, are commonly seeing multi-vector attacks. Multi-vector means all the different ways a bad guy is going to try and get into your system, from email, as Nick mentioned, finding things on a disk or a USB stick these days, downloading things from the web. Those are all the different vectors of attack that are constantly coming in and having issues or potential issues with your network. It was reported that these 67% of these folks were seeing these kinds of attacks, and this is a big concern, very significant rise from just 56% just a year ago. So it's on the rise, it's on the increase. So what about experiencing all these layered attacks? Layered attack is kind of the same situation with multi-vectors. It's all the different layers. We have network layers, application layers, all the different things that are on a computer. And those same reports were reporting 95% constant attacks against a substantial increase, very, very frequent in 2016. It's just all on the rise. And what's really interesting is that 21% even said that they're getting 50-plus attacks a month. Now, this is a broad spectrum of customers ranging from a few endpoints to thousands of endpoints. So it's very prevalent, again, just always increasing. It's increased over 8 to 10% just from last year. So what about some of the other kind of dedicated attacks? We also see things called advanced persistent threats. APTs is kind of a common acronym, another IT acronym because we don't have enough. APTs is becoming the new kind of talking point around how the bad guys are getting in. It's not just as simple as clicking things anymore. It's very advanced. They're very persistent about getting into your network. So what are some of those security issues? What are some of the attacks? Another report that was put out by Efficient IP shows a very similar set of trends. Among the organizations it surveyed, 76% of these organizations said they were subject to DNS attacks. Their routers and their firewalls reported that they were trying to be attacked heavily attacked. And what are some of those things? What are some of those network exploits? These are some of the things we don't normally commonly talk about. We hear about ransomware, and we hear about all the different attack people. We talk about, people trying to get your stuff and use Bitcoins and all these other terms. But a lot of times we don't hear about these, network exploits, these things that are kind of underlying within a network infrastructure. We know about antivirus and malware and tools on endpoints to sort of stop those things. But again, what about the network layer, these underlying concerns like botnets? Botnets can do multiple things. A botnet is sometimes very quiet on a network. It can actually act as a command and control center, which means it's putting out bad malicious payloads. Some of those are zombies that come into a network, and unless you have something that keeps those from getting on the network, they can act badly on behalf of whatever the malicious actor was trying to attempt. And again, as I mentioned, advanced persistent threats. These are attacks that are coming from different layers, different approaches, everything from file-based that Nick kind of touched on earlier. And then one of the trends that Webroot's seeing is a lot of file-less, things that are not specific to a file, things that are web-based, man-in-the-middle attacks. There's file-less approaches where code can get into your registry, get into your Atom table, get into these really obscure areas and get into the machine and do really a lot of bad things. These are these advanced options and advanced methodologies that the bad guys are approaching and taking. And keep in mind, these guys are well-funded. They've unfortunately been paid a lot in ransomware, and they're very well-funded. Some of the others just briefly mention is drive-by downloads. One that folks often forget about is when you just go to a website, sometimes the little piece of the code will land on a machine that's undetected, unknowing, things that you're not even seeing. It doesn't even present. It doesn't even come up and ask you to download something or do something or take action. It's just a piece of code that lands in a cookie or in a cache or in a temporary area and for future exploitation or immediate exploitation, depending on what the malicious guy is trying to do. And, of course, phishing is ever prevalent, ever present. Nick mentioned KnowBe4, a company that does phishing attacks. We have a phishing capability and awareness program within the Webroot framework. We're very much aware of all the phishing that's exploited and taken advantage of out in the world. And all these things are constantly, in some form or factor being presented on the network. And the interesting thing is that if you're not aware, ports 80 and 443 are the two primary firewall ports that everything transfers on. Everything happens on these two ports. When you go to a website, when you go to an FTP site, when you download, even when you get a certificate of security, you see the lock in your browser, that's port 443. That's a secure network or secure transference. But these two ports are wide open, and everything transfers on them. And what basically ends up happening is we sort of leave these two front doors open. Well, of course, the bad guys understand this, and they know that. They're very technical. They're hackers. And so they go in and try and exploit those type of open doors. They try and exploit those kind of things that are happening. So what are some of these risks? I've touched on APTs. I've touched on botnet malware, DNS changer Trojans. These are basically zombies that come in and try and redirect your DNS to bad sites that you may think you're going to legitimate sites. Of course, we've got ransomware, and we've got traditional just web-based activity. So these are the kind of risks that drive DNS. DNS is that underlying architectural component of I type in a domain name, a logical domain name, webroot.com, and it sends me to a complex IP address or series of IP addresses. We never think about that. This has been around since the 80s, so it's just so ubiquitous that we forget about all the different approaches. And so I just mentioned, what is DNS? DNS is that simple user, human naming of a physical machine identification, makes it simple to remember. We all know Google.com, we all know Facebook.com, et cetera, and those things can be exploited. So let's talk about a little bit more of some of those, what are the kind of exploits that we're seeing? We're actually finding that this is kind of a scary slide in some form or fashion, that we're actually finding that 85% of legitimate websites at some time in their life and some time in their existence has had malicious links associated, whether direct or indirect. I mean, there are things like adware or malicious adware that can be presented as legitimate ads that can go out onto news sites or go out onto your favorite site that you go to for information, or your social media site. And a lot of times you see these ads, and sometimes those ads can and will and do actually have malicious code and bad guys inside, as we like to call them, bad guys. Some of that code can come in and look like everything's normal and common. So this is just some of the concerns that we see as we move forward in our threat concerns. There's other approaches. I've been talking about DNS. A very common approach is web filtering. So some folks say, okay, well, great, this is kind of scary. We got all these concerns. What do we do to stop and ensure that our network is in good standing? And a lot of tools have been out there for a number of years. Web filtering has been out there for several years. One of the issues is it's proxy-based. Proxy deployments are very complicated, requires lots of complex servers. It's very expensive to scale across a number of locations. And proxy systems and the complexity of those solutions can cause slowdowns, performance issues. Users start to notice slowness, a little bit of latency, a couple of seconds to hit a website. Things of that nature can affect their experience, their day-to-day life and activity. And because we now all live on the web, we're constantly using the web for a variety of our activities. And all spectrums of business, any latency or slowness can really impact productivity. Policy servers can be very complex. I mean, these servers put all these complex rules in place. Kind of think of it like a firewall for your web categorization. It's all this complex, can I go here, can I not go there, and how is all that configured? And the other problem with all that complexity is getting the right information at the most timely fashion to those policies, to those users, so they know that they're going, or that the content that they are going to is legitimate and valid. And that complexity and that filtering isn't always accurate if it's not up to date, if it's got time delays from when it's determined that a website is bad to when it gets to all that complex infrastructure and that proxy information and that stuff that drives that user experience. It could be minutes, hours, or days, depending on the type of technology that is in place. So bottom line is this ends up compromised sites or malicious code sites can still get through these web filtering systems that many IT solutions have been out there for years. And unfortunately, because of that complexity, too many bad sites still can kind of sneak through. So what else are successful companies doing? What are they doing to ensure this type of activity is minimized, to ensure their user experience is great, and to make sure that everything that their network inside their network, servers to workstations to all data, is protected? They're doing things like securing their DNS protection. They're ensuring that that they're managing this uncontrolled web access and making sure that DNS is protected. DNS is becoming a very popular concern, much more awareness around it. Again, as I said earlier, it's very ubiquitous, but we are becoming much more aware. So we're doing things like choosing a DNS-based solution rather than just using our own servers or using Google or using our upstream ISP. We're now looking at solutions that offer some of the same capabilities of the complex web filtering and the proxy systems, but it is much more scalable and easier to implement and much more simple to operate and manage. So companies are looking at these type of systems to ensure, again, just one more layer of protection on top of their other layers of protection because the architecture is so suspect. They're doing things like testing multiple vendors, looking at lots of different vendors, and still deploying web filtering. DNS has a much higher accuracy regarding web filtering, and they're in the way that it works. It's such a simplistic methodology for getting web interfaces to the right place that we can actually put some filters in place that are much more accurate and much faster and much higher performance. And they're putting simple policies in place. A lot of the web filtering systems and solutions that have been out there for 10, 15 years have gotten so complex and so hard to manage that DNS solutions are now looking at a much more simplified policy. It's pretty straightforward. Is this a bad site? Yes, don't go there. Does this site meet a certain categorization? Yes, don't go there. Or it's one that you're allowed, you can go there. It's pretty simple gatekeeping, yes or no. And the whole goal is to ensure that users are not going to places that are A, inappropriate, and or B, malicious. So really, this is one of the functions that companies are looking at. A lot of MSPs are looking to service their customers. Large enterprises are looking at DNS protection. So it's just a big focus as another layer of protection. So let's talk a little bit more about how DNS actually works. What are some of the things that we see both here at Webroot and around the industry? What does it do, and how are we projecting, fixing the protection and ensuring that ongoing protection? So we have a product, Webroot SecureAnywhere DNS Protection, very similar to some of the things I've already been talking about. It's very critical and crucial that DNS protection services are out there to protect your system, to protect your connections, and ensure that your organization can operate without any downtime or any problems. So what are we doing? We try and stop DNS attacks by protecting that connection. We reduce the amount of attacks that are happening, those infections that are showing up, by 90%. A lot of times without some kind of DNS protection, you're relying 100% on another system, usually an endpoint protection application. Without any kind of DNS protection, you are now 100% dependent on your AV or on your security endpoint, on your endpoint, and that can still be good. Webroot has a good product. There's a lot of good products out there that can stop and block those things, but wouldn't it be better to get it stopped at the gate and at the beginning? And that's really what we're kind of talking about here today, is how do we stop malware before it even gets into your environment? So there's a few other areas. We filter high-risk sites with very, very low latency. So with DNS being milliseconds to respond, our latency is very low. Because DNS system checks addresses at internet speed, it can filter those addresses and categories almost real time without any noticeable speed performance or hits by your users. So 0 to 0 latency, milliseconds to 0 latency. And what this does, it really helps when you want to control and have visibility of users' access and what they're doing, using both policies for content control as well as security risk, both to increase productivity and really to have a much better web usage experience while they're at work and while they're within their daily productivity. So all this combines and adds up to really providing security gains above and beyond just the endpoint. It can be done at the gateway for all devices, anything that shows up on a network. You can also manage it at a granular level down on the endpoints themselves. So you have some flexibility depending on your environment. If you've got guest networks, one of the great things there is to ensure that when your guests come into your network, even if they've got an isolated area, that they are not introducing anything into your network. They pull up their iPad, they pull up their laptops, they pull up their phones. They jump on your network as Wi-Fi is very prevalent everywhere, and it gives them much higher speeds. Well, you want to ensure that those devices are protected, and again, that those devices aren't introducing anything into your network. With the DNS protection in those types of scenarios, it really helps your staff continue to maintain productivity to ensure those lower risks, especially around guest networks and BYOD being such a prevalent thing today, bring your own device. So what are some of the key features? Again, I'll just touch on this very briefly. In our world, there's no hardware software agent or service install. It's simply a gateway redirect. You send that traffic over to our servers, and our servers handle the respective policies and respective concerns. Those policies have the categorization, the content, where that user can and can't go. You can do things like block all users, You can do all kinds of things, or block all sites and add just where you want to go. You can also just block specific sites or specific categories that your environment, your customer, and or your business dictates. We block malware threats right there at the DNS level, especially with all the heavy web usage. Again, this is taking care of it at the domain level before it even hits the browser. So if the browser can't even get to the site to get a drive-by piece of code, then we are ensuring that that malware and that threat is never even introduced into the network, and we're stopping it instantly at the very, very beginning. We have IP policies and IP ranges that we can define what users and where they're coming from within your network. Again, I kind of mentioned and alluded to guest networks. Guest networks can have its IP address. You can set up a policy for your guests. You can set up a different policy for your internal network infrastructure, your users, and your customers. So you can define those different needs depending on how you like to stop and block things, both malicious as well as just standard categories. So there's a lot of reporting. Obviously, we're capturing lots of data. We've got a lot of IP addresses and DNS and where people are going, where people are getting blocked. So we have a rich set of data that can help your environment and your customer know what's happening on networks and where they're going. So we can do on-demand drill-down reporting. We can do schedule reporting where all this information goes out at a cadence or a time frame that is effective or required for your customer or your needs, and so they can know what's happening in their environment. One of the other things that's kind of a behind-the-scenes aspect is it's all driven by what we call Bright Cloud. Bright Cloud is our threat intelligence. We crawl the web IP and web space 3 times a day, and we categorize all that information. We can hit about 96% of the web, of all public-facing websites and web presence and anything that's public-facing. The other 4% is typically your government and non-public-facing or private networks, but all the public-facing is crawled, and we categorize. We understand what exactly is happening. We understand what's happening content-wise. We understand what's happening at those sites. And we catalog all that, and we determine, what they're all about, what they're doing. We're kind of a mini Google, if you think, only we don't have you search it. We actually present it within our technology, and in this case, within the DNS. So if we've got a content site that has some adult content, we categorize that as adult, and we don't present that. We also categorize that as malicious if it's something where it's a malicious site, command and control center site, or something that looks legitimate but in fact is malicious. All that aspect is part of our Bright Cloud, and that's all part of the classification service that is all powered directly within our solution. So how does our solution work? I'll touch on this very, very briefly because DNS is pretty straightforward. It's just send it to a set of forwarders, send it to a set of servers, and then we handle the rest. So in essence, there's not going to be any difference within the network that you're already experiencing today, but instead of using the DNS forwarders that you may publish from your ISP or through some other mechanism through public-facing IPs, Google has a DNS server. If you don't know that, FYI, Google has their own DNS servers, and a lot of people use them because Google's so ubiquitous, Google's out there, Google's well known, so a lot of people will just use Google's DNS servers. What you're going to be doing is sending all that DNS traffic to our server architecture. We have 5 points of presence around the globe. We have 3 points of presence here in the United States, 2 actually in APAC, so it's actually 8, I apologize. 5 here in the United States, 2 in APAC, and 2 in Europe and 1 in APAC. And each of those points of presence have thousands of servers behind them. And the idea is from a geolocation perspective. So regardless of where your users go, if your user goes to Chicago on a trip, they're going to be protected through and have go to the fastest server there. To go to Orlando for a show, like Nick's down at the Ignite show, while he's down there, it's going to go to the closest data center there. If they go to California, go there. And if they fly to Europe, then they're going to still be protected, and it's going to send them to traffic that's localized to that area. So basically, we're going to cover them regardless of where they are, and everything's going to filter through our server farms to ensure the policies are applied, the classifications are applied, and the sites are blocked regardless of location, wherever they are in the world. So what makes some of the differences with our product based upon either what you already have in place today and or, again, using one of these other services? There's much less to manage. We take a very simplistic approach here at Webroot. Fast is beautiful, small is beautiful, very quick and efficient administrative consoles. So we like to, and we're a SaaS model, so everything's done in the cloud. So there, again, very little to manage. There's nothing on-prem. There's nothing to set up. There's nothing to install or configure. It's a single endpoint agent for those that you need granular roaming. There's no console, no new console. It's all part of an existing console. If you're a Webroot SecureAnywhere agent purchaser or user, so much less to manage. And because of the reduction in infections, we definitely lower the cost. It's one of the benefits of most of the Webroot products. Very easy to deploy. Again, a lot of large customers have deployed our DNS product within minutes. A few settings on the console and a few settings at your router, gateway, or endpoint, and your users are protected. We use the exact same administrative console called the GSM, Global Site Manager. It's our administrative console where folks come in and manage all their endpoints today, set their policies up, and all that's integrated in with the exact same interface. It's all automated, very quick installation. There's not much to push and do. We have a roaming agent. And then, as I mentioned earlier, it's all driven by our Bright Cloud Threat Intelligence, which is used by many, many companies, not just our own products. We resell our threat intelligence to many router firms now, many content filter solutions out there now. That intelligence has been around for a number of years, so we're taking advantage of and using that same information that's going out to the likes of Cisco, Citrix, F5, et cetera. So let's talk about briefly why Webroot. What makes us more special than everyone else? What are our numbers for reasons for making that decision? Well, first, we're replacing a lot of web security services that are already out there, a lot of proxy services that are already out there. So we have developed this for enterprise market. We've been using this technology, and we're very relevant to customers, and we're very involved in the MSP space today. We're very active. That is our business focus, is around MSPs. Our research with MSPs and all these small, medium companies have said they wanted DNS protection. We're understanding and they're recognizing the issues and the service and the solution problem. The problem is that they're looking for solutions, and we believe that we have a strong offering to ensure that DNS is protected. Definitely, we're a security company, so our background with the web and the internet and Bright Cloud definitely brings a lot of experience and knowledge to the table. Those are, again, some of the reasons why Webroot might be a strong consideration. What are some of the things that we're finding today from our intelligence? We're finding 27 billion URLs that we're tracking and categorizing. That is a lot. 13 billion behavior records. Nick mentioned earlier a lot of companies, AV products, use heuristics and behavior and understanding using machine learning and artificial intelligence, how things are happening, not just a matter of if something's good or bad, but is it acting bad? Is it behaving badly? So we have well over 13 billion behavior records. We're very, very prolific on domains, so not only just URLs, which are subcomponents of a main domain, but we also track 600-plus million domains, the root domain, webroot.com, cnn.com, yourcompany.com. We are categorizing those and understand what the content is around those domains. We also have a big mobile presence. We have a product for both Android and iOS, and so we have a lot of knowledge about mobile apps because mobile is becoming much more prevalent. What kind of things get on mobile apps and then get out into the world either through the mobile infrastructure or to your own network? So we have millions of apps categorized and reputation set up and configured for that. Lots of IP addresses. Behind all those URLs and domains are IP addresses, physical number values that represent a server or a set of servers. We know about those type of activities, just like the domain. We have millions of connected sensors. So we act, all of our products, all of our endpoint agents act as additional sensors. We have 40 million, and I think this number is actually a little low. We're pushing 50 million as of this year. So we have lots of sensors that feed that artificial intelligence, feed that machine learning, and feed all of our Bright Cloud threat intelligence for a full-rounded set of knowledge on what's happening out in the world, what's happening on websites, what's happening, in your environment, and then helping others, helping your other, web community and web users stay safe. What are some of the quick benefits? Adding DNS layers is just another layer. We've talked about multi-vector protection. We've talked about multi-layer protection in a variety of different areas. This is just one more layer. Always best to have multiple layers. We enforce acceptable web usage. It ensures that users are going where they should be going, and users are going to or not going to sites or getting blocked by sites going to sites that they shouldn't be. Increased security, which obviously increases productivity and visibility and minimizes your impact on your techs having to do a lot of work and cleanup. It reduces risk infections. All those related costs, all that time and man hours cleaning messes up and going and figuring out what happened in the network and how do you clean things up. That's at lowering those costs. People costs of money. That is one of the costliest factors in any business. And when people are all spending time cleaning up messes or problems within the network rather than doing productive things that are either helping the profitability of a company, it definitely is a much better enriched environment. Again, very easy to deploy and manage. We're fully integrated with our existing admin consoles. When and if we do have an agent, it's all single agent based. You're not having to manage another agent. So those are just some of the quick benefits to the actual solution itself. And so that's what we have in place. There's a lot of other activities that Webroot brings to the table, but really since we're talking about stopping everything at the beginning, DNS protection is just another layer that you can take and utilize with your company. So with that, Nick, I'm going to hand it back over to you. That is the end of my presentation. And if there's any questions, I see a few have come in. Go ahead and add them and include them. And Nick, back to you.
Thank you very much. That was actually a great presentation, Shane. Just the very thought of leveraging DNS rather than doing all, let's say, web scans and things like that. You're really at the heart of where the problem is, and since you're on top of it, that's a great way to stop stop malware from ever coming in. That was great presentation. I really was impressed by that. So there's actually a number of questions that have come in. The very first one that came in, let me see if I get these in the right order. I'm trying to do this based on when people put these in here. So David asked, and David, I'm actually going to give this back to you because I'm not sure which one, but you said, what's the name of the malware report? I mentioned one, and maybe actually we can both answer this. I'm not sure, Shane, if you mentioned a malware report. I know you mentioned a couple of them. I mentioned a malware report, which was KnowBe4's, I think it was Endpoint AV Effectiveness Report. But did you mention one as well that was specific to malware, and if so, what was it?
There was one where it's just infrastructure security report. It's actually a link on, I think, slide 3 or 4 of my presentation. If you guys are handing this presentation out, the report will be in a link there, so keep an eye out there. We also have a threat report. If you're interested, I'll just throw it out there. We have a threat assessment report that Webroot puts out every year based on what we learn from our sensors, from our customers, from our base, as well as what's happening in the industry across the board. So you can take a look for that as well.
Okay, very well, good. So there's another question here. Leopold asks, he's talking about the difference between like OpenDNS and Webroot. Do you have any commentary there? I don't know if you want to start doing comparisons, but it's a question here that I'd at least ask if the audience is wondering.
Yeah, fair enough. That's a typical comparison. We are pretty much in that same space. That it would be the space that we're involved with. The value proposition we bring to the table is single administrative console, single client. We're not having to manage multiple things. Our Bright Cloud threat intelligence is number one in the industry, so we have a very robust categorization, IP awareness, reputation awareness that we bring to the table that is consequently purchased by Cisco. So, Cisco is a large customer of ours. They also own that company. Again, I'm not into, good, bad, or indifferent. OpenDNS has a product. They're a great company. They do a great thing. I believe that they're focused a little more on enterprise, but again, I'm not involved. I don't know that. Our focus is very MSP focused, very specific to the MSP market. We're here to help you grow, help your business, help your customers, and that's kind of our focus. So, technology one-to-one, I'm not going to sit there and go down, feature benefit, feature one, feature two, but just know that we bring us the same DNS protection both at the gateway network layer as well as the client layer.
That's a very fair answer. Instead of going, option number one, we rock. Option number two, we rock. Feature number three, we rock. Because that would be, kind of a little biased. So that was a very fair answer. Another question here about how would this work with mobile devices. And then there's a little bit around here, and there's a couple of questions all mashed into one question. And what happens, for example, if they're using their own cellular network instead of Wi-Fi, maybe if it's going to switch the DNS settings, things like that. And what about their different locations, that kind of thing? How do you handle mobile devices?
Great question, actually. There's a couple of different responses to that. If you've got it set at the gateway level layer, and I kind of alluded to, guest networks, if you want to, guest network protected, those mobile devices come in and they join that network, then they're going to be subject to just through the DNS structure, no agent, nothing on the device is required. They're just going to be subject to the web policies or the policies that are put in place as to where they can go, where they can't go. By default, security is, the number one set of categories. I think we have about 25 or 30 categories that are wrapped around phishing and wrapped around, malicious sites and wrapped around key logging sites and all these kind of malicious sites. So we're going to immediately stop and block those. Now for customers still using their network, their wireless network, obviously there's not much we can do to that. Funny question. Funny enough, though, we do have a lot of mobile presence, mobile ISP companies that are looking to license the technology. So there's a pretty strong chance that you may, be using some wireless solution that has some kind of Webroot threat intelligence incorporated into it. We are actually expanding that in the Japanese market. Not that that has anything to do with the U.S., but just that be known that those kind of expectations are starting to grow. We're seeing that trend, grow both abroad and here in the United States. So right now we don't have a mobile agent. If that's the second precipice of the question, that is something we're looking at. Again, this product is fairly young. Our DNS product's only been out for about a year, so it's a fairly young product as far as productized. The data behind it obviously has the full strength of Webroot and our Bright Cloud threat intelligence behind it all. But as we expand requirements, as customers come to us and say, we need a mobile thing, we need a mobile client, we'll certainly look at expanding that. Today it's Windows, and tomorrow will be Mac, and then we'll start looking beyond in 2018 at mobile devices.
Very good answer. So I've got kind of two questions that I'm going to kind of merge into one because they're very related. It's about blocking specific traffic. And the first one is around, can you kind of default to blocking everything and then allow, in essence, you put a blacklist of star.star, so to speak, and then allow only specific URLs, specific domains in the whitelist. And the other kind of part of this question that came from another user was, can you block in the block page and those definitions be customized per user?
Great question. And the short answer is yes. So what you would do in that scenario is basically block everything. So there's 84 categories that Bright Cloud tracks. Within our DNS product, we actually have 78 categories that are selectable on or off, and that's mostly because some of the malicious sites that we might break down from a security perspective at the Bright Cloud level don't necessarily need to be presented for an administrator to turn on or off. Consequently, we also have what's called uncategorized. That is actually one of those 78 categories. Uncategorized is a category exactly what it says. If you fire up a brand new domain today, Shane Cooper's Cool Web Server Today.com, the likelihood between the moment I hit go at the registry's office or code or site wherever I register that domain to the moment Webroot picks that up, that's going to be some time. There may not even be content on that domain for a week or two or a day or an hour or whatever the time frame is. We put all that stuff into uncategorized. So you, in theory, can block the entire internet, the entire web, and say, here's the 5 URLs you can go to: Facebook, CNN. And I'm not picking on these people. I'm just kind of using an example. Or my company's website, my vendor website that I do all my business, my time clock website, and that's it. You can't go anywhere else, can't do anything else, and that's it. So that's one, I think, the answer to the question about blocking everything and allowing a very small subset. Then consequently on the block page side, right now we do it by for your entire environment, so it's kind of a generic block page. We have had a lot of customers ask for more customizable block pages by site. We look at each site as an individual, manageable component. That site can be, a client or a customer if you're an MSP. And so we have had some discussions, and that is on the roadmap and coming out.
So there's another question, so kind of related. You mentioned about the uncategorized. Although you're talking about blocking it, the question was basically what happens, and I think this is sort of like a by default sort of question because there's a little bit of context. I'm assuming the audience is lacking around the product, obviously, that you have a lot more expertise. And it's what if there's a site that's completely unknown to Webroot? Will the service simply not allow it? And obviously you made the point you can block it, but what happens sort of by default, I think is what they're asking.
By default, it is allowed. I mean, we're not going to assume negativity. We kind of have this kind of general concept here within Webroot that you're innocent until proven guilty. That's just sort of, an overarching, we don't think that everything out there in the world is bad until you prove that it's good, and then we allow it. We kind of take the approach that, being a good web citizen says, hey, look, you're probably doing a good thing, and then as soon as you look like you're doing a bad thing, we're going to stop and block you. Uncategorized, again, will be allowed by default. To be allowed, you can, as I mentioned, go in and turn that off in your policy settings.
Perfect. The simple question, I think you answered this one pretty easily. Will this work in the terminal server environment? Someone's asking. It
will. It works just fine. We've done a lot of testing around it. The only caveat is because terminal servers provide multiple sessions, we don't granularly break it down by different sessions today. So it's a machine level or a server level policy construct. Again, we're looking at that for a future option. So everybody that's on that terminal server will be subject to the same policy criteria. But it does work.
Perfect.
Works fine.
And
not a big problem.
Good. I've got one more question. We got a couple more minutes in the hour, so if you guys in the audience have a question, by all means, stick those in the Q&A box. The last question sounds like it really comes back to someone was paying attention to some of the stuff you're talking about specifically around your product, and it talks about how long do the changes to the GSM take effect for that particular, they said policy blacklist, whitelist, to take effect is the question? Yep.
That's a great question. So that's once I configure these things, or if I make a change, or if I'm, adding an allowance or a blockage, how quickly does that get out to my users? The short answer is milliseconds. Our solution has a millisecond kind of an SLA for our internal infrastructure. Obviously, though, the one caveat is, of course, how your network infrastructure permutates down. We can't control that. So what we control and how quickly it gets to those policies in our border servers, the complex servers that drive all that, is milliseconds.
And then the last question just popped in is, do you have any Active Directory integration?
That's a great question. It does pop up quite a bit. The short answer is no. We probably will do that when we get more of a user-based policy control mechanism in place. And I kind of alluded to that with the whole terminal server aspect because ours is machine-based. Our host or endpoint protection is kind of device-dependent. We really don't have much of a user construct for Active Directory integration, but I think as we move towards that user-based option, Active Directory will play a much higher role. We have a former proxy-based system that's been sunsetted, and we had an Active Directory integration with that component. So I see us moving that over as we expand that usage or that requirement.
Sounds good. Wait, I think there's one more popped in. Okay, so this is actually, I think, maybe of a follow-up or a question. It says, so can reports be run based on an endpoint?
It can, correct. Yep, we can track what that endpoint was doing, where they went, and we can report on it.
Okay, very good. So it looks like we've got about 6 minutes left. So I think we're going to let the class out early today. Everyone gets a couple extra minutes back into their day. Hey, Shane, thank you very much for a great presentation today. I think it was really informative, and it was really nice to kind of see under the covers a little bit around not only how Webroot does things, but really sort of how the approach truly does help deal with the problem of malware and try to prevent it as much as possible. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. It was a pleasure being here. Thank you for your time.
Of course. And you guys in the audience, thanks for your questions. Really appreciate those as well. And if for some reason I missed one of your questions and we didn't get to it, someone from Webroot will reach out to you personally and make sure that we get that question answered. I think I got them all, but just in case I didn't, just so that you know, someone will definitely get that question answered. Be sure to take a look at our next webcast here. You can see the URL at the bottom there, forums.thefarguy.com/webcast, and it's on technology buying decisions, and it's all about business outcomes. So with that, again, I'm Nick Cavalancia, Penton contributor. So thank you for attending, and this concludes today's webcast.